Maybe we'll get to see Eagle soar by today. I'm very excited to be here today with Fran Wilde, editor of Sunday Morning Transport. So welcome, Fran. So great to see you.
Thank you so much for having me. We're very excited to be here to talk about the Sunday morning transport.
And I should say, actually, this is my first time talking to an editor of like a genre magazine. So I'm going to have a lot of questions about that because I've long been in the literary fiction, poetry kind of realm. And I know
Sure.
very little actually about fantasy, sci-fi, all that stuff. I'm so curious. So thanks again. And I'm really excited to cross the bridge to
I
genre.
mean, we're glad to have you here. It's so funny because it's not really a bridge, but happy to talk about it.
Sure, sure, great. So why don't we jump in?
Maybe a portal. Maybe it's like a
Oh
door in
yeah.
a wardrobe or just
An
kidding.
interdimensional portal.
Definitely.
So when did you start the magazine and what was your impetus for creating it?
So my editor-in-chief, Julian Yap, who is one of the origin directors for Serial Box and Realm, which specialized in audio fiction that you could listen to while you were on your commute before the pandemic happened. I worked for him on several projects for that, and this project came about because he was at home, like many of us were, and just sitting there thinking, you know what I would really like is for somebody to drop a fantastic short story in my inbox once a week without me having to do anything. And of course, when you're editor in chief, you definitely have to do a lot of things. And he and I sat down in the summer of 2021 and blocked out sort of our 5-year plan and our 10-year plan, what we would love to see in a short fiction, really short fiction literary magazine. 3,500 words is our normal cap for short fiction. And what we really wanted to do was have that short story, that length, emailed in every Sunday. You can access it on the app, you can access it on the website as well, but it really does come down to we try and keep it simple and focused on the story that emails in every Sunday, just so that it can capture the imagination of our readers as they're drinking their first cup of coffee or tea in the morning before everything sort of kicks in. And that's kind of why we started it is because we both love short fiction and we wanted to support authors of short fiction and bring new audiences to them and bring new authors to people who really loved short speculative fiction,
Mm,
particularly, which crosses the gamut from, what we were joking about earlier with fantasy and science fiction in particular, to things that are much more literary speculative, like Slipstream and some of the things that are very popular on the streaming services right now, like 100 Years of Solitude is similar to
mm,
in certain ways to things that we would publish and consider part of our literary grouping. We
mm,
do some light horror. There are some moments of the absurdist that come in. We have portal fantasies that happen in theaters. Nino Cipri last year wrote a fantastic story about actors working on Our Town, and they slip into a parallel universe, which was
mm,
just perfect for the scheme of things and the story and everything
mm,
else.
mm,
Um, it's been really exciting. We've been running this now. We're in the second month of our fourth year. We publish about 50 stories a year, so that is a lot of stories that have come across my desk. I review every story. We are a curated solicitation only magazine, which means that we do not have a slush pile.
mm.
But what we do is our authors often recommend to us people that we should reach out to and ask, hey, do you have a story that might fit what we're doing? We have said no to some stories, even though we're soliciting them. And most of the stories fall into a couple of different categories for me where I get it on my desk and I'm like, this is amazing. There's just a few slight tweaks and things, and then I can send it off to copy edits. There are a few where I have a call with a writer and we talk about, where the story is going in particular and how might they, stretch it out or condense it a little bit more. And then there are some that are just absolutely perfect. It goes straight out. We have a brilliant part-time copy editor, Caitlin Severini, who works in the industry, as well as a magnificent proofreader in Christine Ma. And those are my the mainstays of my weekly work is this very small team
Mhm.
that just focuses on one story a week, usually trying to work far in advance so that we have a good log of stories and bringing them out in a way that is um, able to keep the focus on the story and the author.
Mhm. I have so many questions, so much interesting stuff here. But
Sure.
one thing that I'm particularly curious about is you mentioned at the outset you laid down your 5-year plan and your 10-year plan, which
Mhm.
I don't know if a lot of editors, when they're first starting out, do that. I don't know actually
I
what
mean,
the.
we laid out a 2-year plan too, but I figured since we blew past that already that
No,
we
I think it's
um
great because, yeah, I mean, we've all
and
seen too many lit mags fold and people get really excited, and then 2 years later they can't sustain the work. So having like a 5-year vision and 10-year sort of
yeah.
benchmarks, I think that's a really important step. So at the 4-year mark, do you feel like you are kind of where you wanted to be and it's shaping up to your vision?
I think obviously we would love to double our readership.
Mhm.
And I think Julian would probably throw a party if we doubled our readership at this point. We are, like many short fiction magazines, really reaching to stay afloat. It is sustainable in certain workload ways, but we do need the support of a subscriber base, and we're looking for that in many different ways right now. We're trying to figure out how to get past year 5 and keep going.
Mhm.
There are things that we want to do that are on the horizon that are really, really exciting that I think I would get in a lot of trouble if I mentioned right now. But I am hopeful that we are able to keep going. And I am so grateful to our paying subscribers. The model that we work on is we do one free story a month. And then the other three stories are they go out with a partial. And then if you want to read more, you need to subscribe, which means that everybody gets one free story a month. There are 2 months out of the year in January and July where we do fundraising and all the stories are free. So actually, there are more free stories. July, because that's my birthday month and that's my gift
Mhm.
to everybody that's subscribing. But it's still a reach, and the way that our readers take our stories and share them with others and talk about them on social media and say, these are the stories that really resonated with me, and I would love for you to read them, makes it possible for us to keep going.
Mhm.
And that
Right.
was part of what we hoped to build into the structure from the beginning.
Yeah.
I think it's hard when you start a magazine and it's all enthusiasm and you really, really want to get the best out there,
Mhm.
and you realize that the work that because I know so many different editors who are just buried in work and they
Mhm.
aren't necessarily they get the burnout is very bad and very hard. And
Yeah.
as a working writer as well and as an author myself, I really do want to see everybody who's trusting us with their stories know that we have a plan to get that story out,
Mhm.
just like every other. I mean, the speculative fiction editors are an incredibly professional bunch.
Mhm.
It's very hard out there, but everybody works super hard, and we want to be one of those magazines that people trust with their stories.
Yeah. Yeah. So if somebody is listening to this, they're really excited, they have a story that they think would be perfect to send you, but you only take solicited work, how
We
should
actively
they?
solicit writers. I have had writers reach out in terms of how that works. My first goal every week is to get the stories out, to get them edited, to get them out and published. I we have on our about, we say we're a solicitation only magazine, and we cannot spend a lot of time writing back to everybody who hasn't read that letter. There is, if someone is interested in writing for the magazine, my suggestion is to read us to understand what we're publishing. And to be very clear, that there is a list of people who are interested in writing a story for the magazine. I tend to pull from that a couple times a year. I'll go through and say, "Oh, I've gone out and read a couple stories by this person. They seem like they'd be a great match with us." And then I'll ask for a story. But it does take a lot of time, and because we don't have the staff for a slush pile, there isn't a lot of opportunity to do the submission rounds that I myself do as an author.
Mhm,
So,
mhm.
yeah.
Is there a way that a writer could, excuse me, get your attention? Like, let's say they publish in another fantasy magazine and they want to alert you, hey, look what I'm doing. Can I be on
I
this?
read all the fantasy magazines. I read all the science fiction magazines. I have a number of different places that I find writers that I want to work with. I also host a coffee clutch at World Fantasy on occasion, and people can come and talk to me and
Mm,
ask questions about the magazine. Then I will be at Worldcon this year in Seattle, the World Science Fiction and Fantasy. I'm abbreviating, but then I remember, oh, this is a literary discussion. So there's a big conference in Seattle in the fall, and I'll be there, and I will happily answer questions about the magazine during that coffee clutch.
okay.
It's difficult to entertain questions on a rolling basis
Mhm.
when there are other things that are pulling on my attention. So
Mhm.
I'm very appreciative of writers who are respectful of my time, as I think all editors are at the end of the
Mhm.
day.
Sure. We have a question here. How has your own writing and teaching informed your approach as an editor and the aesthetics and tone of the magazine?
Yes and no. I mean, the aesthetics and tone of the magazine is driven by the authors that we choose to solicit. Quite often they'll say, "Well, what do you want? What kind of story do you want? Do you want, and with some of our authors, I've actually said, just write what you really want,
Mm.
write what you've most wanted to write. There's an author named Mary Robinette Kowal who asked me that question, and I came back and said, write what would bring you joy. And so we got a talking cat in space story, which is extraordinary and made me just laugh so hard. But it's a fantastic story as
Mm.
well. When I say talking cat in space, it sounds ridiculous, but the plot and the structure and the characterization and the energy in the story just worked. And that made me just really very happy to see.
Mhm.
Um, as far as my teaching, I've been a writing teacher for a very long time. I ran an MFA program. I have an MFA in poetry, so I lean literary in
Mhm.
my sensibilities. I like lyrical material. But when I get a voice from a writer that really jumps off the page, that catches my attention first.
Mhm.
And that happens in the classroom as well as in the magazine. I've found that editing for the Sunday Morning Transport has transformed me in a lot of ways because editing and teaching are related.
Mhm.
You're not looking for what you would write.
Mhm.
You're looking for what the writer that you're working with really wants to get across, and you're looking at ways to tighten the language and make sure that what they want is coming off the page, not
Mhm.
necessarily what you want. And at the end of the day, it's myself and my editor-in-chief making the calls together. So Julian is at the heart of things a huge science fiction and fantasy nerd. He reads all the best ofs. He has been doing this since the beginning of time. He loves the old school golden era of science fiction as much as he loves the new stuff. And
Mhm.
so we really work together to make sure that there is a great diversity to the stories we publish.
Mhm. Mhm.
We often invite writers who have written for us to come back and write for us again.
Mhm.
We try not to do that too many times because there are a lot of writers that we want to work with. But if we find a voice that is particularly compelling, or if someone is writing, especially a series, we've got several series going
Mm.
right now. David Bowles, the author David Bowles, is writing a series called with a main character named the Midwife, and it's absolutely fascinating as these stories come out.
Mm.
Will Alexander, who is a National Book Award winning children's literature author, is writing an adult science fiction series, and we've got several of those.
Mm.
And then LD Lewis, who is an editor herself for Fire magazine, has been sending us the most amazing stories with the title Margot Poppins Monster Hunter. And we're waiting with great expectation for the next one of those to come in.
Mhm. That's great. So, as someone who's sort of outside the genre world, but really, really curious about it, can you define some terms like what is fantasy? What makes fantasy different from sci-fi, from speculative, slipstream, magical realism, which I think tends to fall more in like the literary camp. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, you know, genre means category, and literary falls into that category. And the literary canon tends to kind of absorb
Mm.
genre titles that it really likes. 100 Years of Solitude is a great example.
Mm.
So is Frankenstein.
Mhm.
And, there are so many different categories of literature. What happens in science fiction and fantasy and horror in particular is that the metaphor becomes real in many different ways, and the setting becomes part of the lens that you look through to examine what it means to be human, what it means to be human in a very different space than a normal literary setting. So the way that I usually define science fiction is that this is the exploration of what it means to be human in the presence of evolving technology.
Mm.
And that can mean just about anything. If you look at Station 11, the novel Station 11, the evolving technology is one of them, is the comic book that moves through the story.
Mhm.
So it is very broad in interpretation, but it does have a tie to technology. Quite often there's something involving space or science in an element, but science fantasy exists also.
Mhm.
It is the literature of the possible. That's the other way that I like to describe it. And fantasy is the literature of the impossible. It
Mm.
is the stories that exist with things that are slightly to the left, slightly sideways, portal universes that are vastly different or slightly different from our own. And those can be science fiction and fantasy universes as well.
Mhm. Do you think that science fiction is sort of uniquely poised to talk about current events? And I remember I actually did read, it was the Best American Sci-Fi, and it was edited by Karen Joy Fowler.
Oh, Karen Joy Fowler is amazing. I
This
love
was
her
for, I
work.
think it was 2017
Uh-huh.
maybe, but she, in her introduction to that, everyone should read her intro if you, whether you like sci-fi or not. It was so interesting. And she was talking about how she, in her view, science fiction is sort of like the best format or the best lens to approach so many of our, global issues, technological issues, political issues. I'm sort of curious if you have like an opinion about that.
I know myself as a science fiction and fantasy writer that
Mm.
the amount of research that goes into not just the setting and the clothing and the characters,
Mm.
but also the technology and the possible iterations of that technology out into the future, um, do give us a unique platform to speak about possibilities.
Mhm.
And in that, I mean, the flip side to what Karen Joy Fowler was saying, which is absolutely accurate, is we get people to think about possibilities,
Mhm.
but then you get I believe it's the Tom Gauld joke about, I wrote this book called "Do Not Create the Torment Nexus," and somebody comes along and picks it up and goes, "Look, I made the torment nexus from your book." And you sort of get caught in this sort of sense of, well, we're living in it feels very science fictional right now. Did
Right.
that happen because somebody wrote a book about it, or did that happen because it was going to happen anyway? Um, and I think that the point of science fiction and fantasy is not to predict the future, and it's
Mhm.
not to, make give people an escape hatch. It's to tell a good story. And just like everywhere else in literature, the impact of a good story, it carries you away, it expands your imagination, and it gives you the ability to empathize with a different way of being.
Mhm.
And that's true for all kinds of genres.
How do I feel like our current technological moment is so advanced. And I don't know how to sort of formulate this question. Like, where else is there to go in thinking about the future and the future possibilities of technology? I feel like we've already arrived at like the most dystopian possible, we're right on the cusp of like, the machines taking over and AI taking so much, and like, is there still there? Well, obviously there has to be room to explore, but I don't know. What are you seeing in the
I hope
sci-fi?
very much that there is room to explore.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think that every person who is a reader or a writer has this idea of possible changes or possible ways that things could be different.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I mean, it's hard to talk about right now because
Yeah.
some of this is very painful right now. But at the same time, that's why we tell stories. We
Hmm.
tell stories to connect the past and the present to the future,
Hmm.
no matter what kind of story they are. And I think that, yeah, there is absolutely space for that. One of my favorite introductions to a book, since we were talking about intros, and by the way, the best American science fiction and fantasy, Hugh Howey edited last year's
Hmm.
Best American and selected one of our author's stories from the
Oh,
Sunday Morning
wow.
Transport to go in it, which was
Oh,
great.
nice.
And that was hold on. I didn't want to mess up the name, so I wrote it down. It's A.R. Capetta's Resurrection Highway, which is one
Hmm.
of the stories. It's available in our archives free, so anybody can go and read this. It's an amazing story,
Hmm.
and A.R. Capetta is a fantastic author, and I just wanted to celebrate that. Um, you're gonna have to repin me and tell me where I was because
I think just thinking about like room to explore
yeah,
and
yeah.
like it feels like the future has sort of caught up with us.
In a way, but I wonder too if that feeling has happened before
Yeah,
during
I'm
great periods
sure.
of
Yeah.
technological change.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, The Life of Poetry, which is Muriel Rukeyser, one of my touchstone poets and authors. She was escaping Franco's Spain in
Hmm.
a lifeboat with a whole bunch of other people being evacuated out of Spain, journalists who had been covering the war. And someone turned to her and said, "Okay, there's like smoke in the distance and everybody's cold and frightened." And goes, "Okay, well, where in all of this is there room for poetry
Hmm.
now?" And she just said, and this is, in the pre-technological times, this is before the internet, before computers, and she just turned to him and said, "Then I began to say what I believe, how important there is always space for poetry." And I feel like there's always space for new stories.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Do you look for so I just tried to read Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson, and I loved it conceptually, and then I felt like what I was missing was the psychological exploration and the character stuff that I'm used to for more literary work. So
Huh.
what do you like to see is because I think that's often like how it's classified, the genre stuff there's more of an emphasis on plot and concept, whereas like literary tends to be more psychological. Obviously, these are broad categories.
I was going to say, Becky, I
Yeah.
feel like that's a really broad brush to apply to an entire genre filled with
Yeah.
people. If I am judging the literary genre by one literary writer,
Mhm.
that would be a real tough thing to do too. I love Neil Stephenson. Snow Crash was one of those eye-openers for me, and the
Mm,
Diamond Age as well. It's not for everyone.
mm,
But there's also just these magnificent Kelly Link short stories that
mm,
have characterization and plot. There is the epistolary novella, This Is How You Lose the Time War, which was written by Max Gladstone and Amal El-Motar, that is basically a time-leaping romance. And there are so many stories in
mm,
between.
mm,
There are plot-based writers like Neil Stephenson. There are character-based writers there, and there are writers who write deeply informed stories that rely on all of these things in the presence of overwhelming technology, like Ted Chiang.
mm,
If you watched Arrival, the movie Arrival, which is based on a story called the Story of Your Life, that is one of those very character-driven stories that is also about huge technological change. So I think that I would encourage anyone who was experiencing okay, I read a speculative fiction book and felt a certain way about it, to read more or to
mm.
ask other people what in the genre would they read,
Yeah, sure.
because there is so much happening out there. And honestly, and this is going to sound like a shameless plug, and you know what? It's a shameless plug. I would encourage you to come and read a month's worth or 2 months worth of short stories in the Sunday morning transport and just see what a variety of writers can do in the span of 3,500 words.
Mhm.
I think you'll find
Yeah,
things that
I
surprise
wasn't,
you.
it was not in any way like a judgment being passed on one genre, but I was leading up to the question of where do you, like the work that you publish, like
Mhm.
do you tend to favor work that includes more psychological depth, or is it all across the spectrum? Does it
We
just,
love work that is
yeah.
all across the spectrum.
Hmm.
We have stories that have casts, major, numerous casts. We have a few multi-part stories, including Sarah Reese Brennan. I don't know if you've read Sarah's work, but hilarious YA characters running around, just being absolutely ungovernable and mesmerizing at the same time. We have stories by writers like Yoon Ha Lee, which are invocations of art and spirit and place and mourning aboard solitary spaceships. So it varies. And you're talking about my favorite conversations. So when you asked the question, I was like, oh boy, I get to have fun now because I am while I'm coming to this conversation as the managing editor of the Sunday Morning Transport, I am also a working science fiction and fantasy writer of adult and children's literature as well. And it is one of my favorite topics to say, well, if you read widely in any genre, including literary, and poetry too, you're gonna find things you love and you're gonna find things that aren't for you. And we try to publish as widely as possible. But one of the big things is we want stories that we love, that we can share with our writers, and with our authors, audiences, especially with our audiences. And also to bring in new people who maybe haven't been reading that much in genre. I have a lot of friends who say, genre is not science fiction is really not what I read for the most part, but I read your stuff and I like it. So maybe I'll read a couple more. And I think our hope is to leave the door open to all kinds of readers.
Mhm. So how do you have a sense of your readers through this? Like what's nice about working with Substack is you can have an immediate connection to your audience and you have a sense of how many people are reading and what their responses are. So what have you seen with your readership?
I mean, we've been very lucky in that we've only been around for 3 years, and our readership has grown to 4,000, over 4,000 readers. They're very active. They get in there and they make comments about different stories. Every year we ask people which are your favorite stories, and we get a lot of discussion from that. But what we see for the most part are people taking the stories out into social media, into convention spaces, into readings, and saying, "Oh, have you read this? You should try this. This is great." And it's not necessarily the stories that we thought were going to hit the
Mm,
biggest that do that. It's somebody, it struck a note with somebody somewhere along the
mhm,
way.
mhm. Do you like publishing on the Substack platform? How has it been working for you?
I like elements of the structure.
Mm,
I like the fact that it lets us focus on story and that it is a direct, it's a tool that allows us to direct email to people that wouldn't necessarily want to go online for one reason or another. We've been doing a lot of research to see if we're still on the best platform for us. As a small staff, we can't just pick up and move. So
mm,
we've been doing this very carefully.
mm,
Um, I appreciate very much the interactivity and also the ease of use. It lets me schedule things and do things that would take a staff to do, and we can't afford that
mm,
because we're busy paying, or we pay a lot. We pay well for the
mm,
industry. We pay 25 cents a word for short stories, which is up to our cap of 3,500 words, which is pretty serious money when you get down to it. And in order to keep that focus on paying writers for excellent stories, the technology sometimes is a very slow turn.
mm,
So we are still looking to at some of the things that Substack reaches out and recommends to us, like you should be doing more of this. And I'm like, if I had
mm.
9 hands, I would definitely be doing more of that.
Mhm. Have you, I remember when blog lit mags were the new thing and people had a lot of ambivalence about it and they felt like, are these online lit mags like real lit mags? Have you encountered that at all as a
Oh
Substack
gosh. I
magazine?
mean, I learned early on because I loved what I loved. I loved literature. I was deeply steeped in Jane Austen and deeply steeped in poetry. And then I absolutely also loved, I came from Buffy fandom. I came out of, huge nerddom. And also I'd been reading science fiction stories since forever. I can remember sitting in the theater watching the first Star Wars and having the cruiser go over my head and just being amazed at how immersive all of this was. And it's very hard for me because I come out of the tradition of both children's literature and adult literature, literary forms like poetry, and also popular fiction forms like fantasy, horror, and sci-fi, to draw the line at what is valid and what is not.
Mm,
I feel like a good story is a good story, and where you find it doesn't necessarily indicate that it's going to be great quality.
mhm, sure.
Yeah, I love stories in the Paris Review. I don't love them all.
Mhm,
The New Yorker, yeah, they tend to hit it out of the park, but they publish a very set
mhm,
um, group of stories with some exceptions that just stun me.
mhm,
I want each of the stories that comes from the Sunday morning transport to stun and surprise and be like, wow, I never read anything like
mhm,
that before. So I think that because you and I probably grew up with the same kind of media influx. I was an early columnist for Geek Mom. I did a lot of the reporting on that level.
mhm,
Before that, I was on, good Lord, I can mention some really archaic like AOL and GeoCities and LiveJournal, all of those, but the ways in which people engaged in narrative communities,
mhm,
um, you knew when you were in a good one.
mhm. Yeah. What are you seeing a lot of in submissions? I feel like you would have your sort of finger on the pulse in terms of trends in technology or anything really in the sort of
It,
scientific world. Are you seeing, are a lot of people writing about AI? Is that a big thing? Or a lot of
it
people writing
has
about?
been in the past.
Hmm.
It's the first year we had an overwhelming number of stories come in that we bought that were about bees. I don't know why. There were just so many bee stories.
Huh.
And This past year, we've had a lot of selkies. We've had a lot of transformation stories. The
Mm,
previous year, there were a lot of urban stories and a lot of portal stories.
mm,
So it is I think you notice when there's sort of a zeitgeist out there,
mm,
and the bee zeitgeist was actually the most impressive. The what we're seeing this year is a whole lot of different things,
mm,
but I think people are looking for ways to shapeshift and
mm,
change their who they are in different settings.
mm,
Maybe as a protective act, maybe as a way to protect others.
mm. So what are common reasons that you would not accept a piece?
In some cases, because the story isn't complete, and then
Mm,
it's not, it's when we've solicited a story, the author has the opportunity to go back and rewrite it. If the story feels like it doesn't have the depth that we're looking for, the characterization isn't there, or the narrative through line is just one note instead of something that has a push and a pull to it, we will usually send it back then.
mm,
If I'm trying to think of a good example. An amazing story comes in that catches me up, and then in the middle of the story, several characters disappear. I'll go back to the writer and say, "Hey, what happened to these guys? I
mm.
was wondering about this."
Not in an intentional like they disappear through the portal.
They're gone.
You just like the writer just forgot about them.
And that happens more than you might think. It has
Mm,
happened to me when I'm writing stories because you get caught up in the plot and you
mm,
totally forget about
mm,
what happened, where's Bob? And
mm,
temptation then is to, something terrible happened to Bob, but that might not go with the story you're telling.
mm,
So
mm,
weaving all those threads together, when a story really sings, it sings in those ways that the narrative and the characters and all of the different um, vehicles for telling story are all working together to get us from the beginning of the story
mm,
to the end in the most concise way.
mm,
And the language is the last thing that we look for to make
mm,
sure that the language of the story is as well considered and well constructed. The craft has got to be great.
mm. Yeah, yeah. Are there sort of common pitfalls that you see in the work that comes to like a lot of writers are starting too late or we've
Uh,
seen this particular theme, we've seen bees like
yeah.
800,000 times. You have to, approach bees in a fresh way if you're going to write about it.
It's a little harder to answer that question for Sunday Morning Transport because of how we go about constructing the magazine.
Mm,
But I was a slush reader for another magazine for many, many, many years ago. And I can tell you that yes, there are common pitfalls.
mm,
There, I was one of those slush readers, and a slush pile for people who don't know is the fire hose of submissions that comes into a lot of different magazines, and volunteer readers go through and pick out stories that stand out to them and send them up for the editors to read because otherwise it's really untenable. And I was one of those people that read a story, and if I didn't like it, I would set it aside to read again because maybe I was hungry or maybe I was in a bad mood and I wanted to give it another chance. The stories that take too long to get started because a short
mm,
story needs to be Elizabeth Bear said this the best. A short story begins as close to the ending as possible, and it begins when a character makes a decision and faces the consequences of those decisions. And that's true whether it's a literary short story or any other short story. When you are engaging with a novel, you have time to explore the world. You have time to really understand the back history and the purpose of things. With a short story, that needs to be kind of baked into the consciousness of the
mhm,
characters,
mhm,
and you can't spend a lot of time sort of pulling the reader out of that story to say, well, the reason why they're doing this is X. You've just got to give the characters and the reader enough information to live to the next sentence
mm,
and to want to read the next sentence as
mhm,
well.
mhm,
And I think that that can happen in slow stories as well as fast stories.
mhm,
But what stops me and throws me out of a story very often is when I feel like the writer is still trying to prepare me to understand the story rather than giving me the tools to
Mm,
understand it in the text.
yeah, that's interesting. Um, are there any specific things that you'd like to see more of in submissions, either in terms of subject matter or style, character?
Um, we really trust our writers
Mhm.
once we solicit them to give us the story of their dreams. So what you're reading when you read a Sunday morning transport story is what the writer really wanted to write most.
Mhm.
So that's what we want to see.
Yeah,
What we'd love to see in our readers is also that sort of interest in helping us support more short stories from more writers.
yeah.
That's our biggest hope right now is that as pe more people hear about us and hear what we're doing, because the discoverability part of my friend Erin McEwen once defined serendipity as that thing you find because the thing that you were looking for was so hard to find.
Mm,
And the serendipity of the internet is makes it really hard to find new things to read because there's so much to read
mhm,
already.
mhm,
But I feel like as the word gets out about what Sunday Morning Transport is doing, we're going to be able to bring in more writers and
mhm.
new voices, and that's going to make me so happy.
Yeah. Is it ever with the solicitation process, is it ever awkward if you don't want to take the story? If you've gone out of your way to
Oh, sure.
solicit the work and then, or maybe it's even a writer that you admire and you're sort of disappointed with the work.
I mean, never disappointed because I know that they're giving me their best.
Mm.
If they weren't giving me their best, that would be a different conversation. But yeah, it's awkward and it's hard because the writing world is small, and these are my colleagues as well. Um, we try to do it with a conversation that says, this is what we're seeing on the page, and I'm wondering if that's where you want to go with it. If they say yes, that's where I want to go with it. We say, well, there's definitely a spot out there for this amazing piece, but it's really not here.
Yeah.
And that is a valid thing to say because if we were to accept everything that we solicited, then there would be that would be a different kind of publication.
Hmm. Who is it, just you reading the work or the whole editorial staff reads it and discusses
I
and
am the first reader. Julian and I read them together, and we sit down and have a meeting every week about incoming stories.
Mhm.
Once we accept the story and contract the story, then we send it to our copy editor, who gives it she's incredible and gives it a very close pass.
Mhm.
If in between that period, we've sent it back to the writer to do a little bit more work on it. That happens as well. And then it comes back through us and goes to, it's a very quick process once we
Yeah.
accept, but not a lot of people do, we only do developmental editing to a certain extent because that timeline isn't quite there either. That's a lot
Yeah.
of commitment.
Hmm. Hmm. Makes sense. So one final question. This is a question that I ask all editors. What keeps you motivated? Sounds like you're also writing and you're teaching and you're very actively reading and finding writers. So what keeps you motivated and inspired to keep doing this work? Because we know it's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. It's just like every other behind the scenes thing where people don't remember that you exist unless you screw up. I what keeps me going is that I get a new story in my inbox.
Yeah.
I'm excited to read, and then I get to share it with 4,000 other people,
Hmm.
and hopefully more than that. I mean, can you imagine sharing that with 8,000 other people? I think that would be great.
That would be great.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Fran, and keep up the great work. And thank
Thank you
you,
so much.
everyone,
And
for
I hope
coming
you
out.
come on by. I would love to have you as a new reader.
Oh, yeah, sure. Thank you.